All right. Thanks everyone for joining today. This is our webinar to discuss security in the age of generative AI. With me today are Joe Crawford, Alexandria Leary, and Stephen Smiley. I'll let them introduce themselves. My name is Emily Ryan. I will be facilitating for you today. I am the Chief Revenue Officer for ScaleSec, and we're really excited to tell you more about generative AI. Joe, do you want to give yourself a quick introduction?
Sure. Hello, my name is Joe Crawford, and I am a consulting director here at ScaleSec. I've been in cloud security for about the last 12 and a half, 13 years, leading implementation and consulting across financial service organizations and large retailers. And I am going to pass it to Alexandria.
Thanks, Joe. I'm Alexandria Leary. I am a senior cloud security consultant here at ScaleSec. I've been with ScaleSec for about 2 years, working in the cloud security in particular for about the last 5. I also have a background in financial services and then have worked with a plethora of other clients in the meantime. Stephen?
Hey, I'm Stephen Smiley. I'm a consulting director here with ScaleSec, and I'm a former military intelligence officer and now a cloud, solutions and security architect. As AI has evolved, I have, continued to keep up with this. I've been helping our customers, use security and use AI securely. And so I'm very excited to be here and talk with you guys today.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Just a couple of reminders. Today, we hope to deepen your understanding of the risks and challenges associated with generative AI. We hope to help educate you about security and compliance considerations when incorporating generative AI into your business. And we want to provide some insight into how you can leverage tools, systems, and services to strategically implement secure generative AI. Just for a couple of housekeeping points, please feel free to use Q&A. The Q&A will be monitored, and if you have a great question that we can address during the session, we will do so. Otherwise, there will be time for questions after the session. This will also be recorded, so if you need to pop in or pop out, we hope you'll stay, but we'll send along a recording after the fact. Awesome. So want to get really started in on the business value, right? We're all kind of thinking about generative AI. We hear it, gosh, every single minute of every day, I feel like. I can't have a conversation that's associated with business and not hear something AI. Joe, I'd love to kind of understand, while many are kind of touting the potential of generative AI, how do you feel like we differentiate between genuine business value and this kind of hype train that everyone is on?
Sure. So it's important to emphasize just the importance of case studies, proofs of concept, ROI calculations, just to demonstrate the concrete value for your specific organization. So this means understanding what your targeted objectives are. So if you are trying to improve the efficiency of software development or reduce testing time by automating test cases with generative AI, it becomes very much easy to define those metrics based on your previous experience and what your baselines have been in the past. So defining those metrics and then measuring those efficiencies gained and then calculating your overall ROI, that can then break down into various phases of POCs to determine where the most benefit is gained. But ultimately, this is going to be on an organization by organization basis as to what generative AI can actually bring to your organization. So it's important to actually look into those case studies and understand what you're trying to achieve in order to make sure that it is valuable for your organization.
Yeah.
Joe, I have a question for you there. So how is this impacted by the pace of evolution of AI right now, right? Because we can do a proof of concept with the current technology, but know that in 6 months or 2 years, that will evolve. So do we have to consider that that evolution as we think about our business value?
So yeah, let's touch on that, right? Because generative AI, let's be clear, it's going to evolve faster than any other technology that we've seen in the past. And that's just from my perspective, and I think a lot of people share that perspective. And I do believe that while the value to each individual organization needs to be substantiated before venturing out, just as we believe that security needs to be figured out before heading out into the world of generative AI. It is going to be those companies that learn to harness generative AI kind of ahead of the game, right? Not looking at it for what it is right now, but reading all the documentation, evolving with it, or even evolving for it as it's coming to market to make sure that you're ready to meet that. I would agree entirely that you do need to pace that just a little bit and plan that this is not going to be a one-time implementation. It's going to be something that you're going to implement, and then you're going to continue to evolve that for the next several decades, more than likely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, just thinking like that's one of the things I've been working with my customers to figure out is to think about the strategy of like, do we want to wait or do we want to be on the forefront of this and be building that muscle so that as it evolves, we're in a position to capitalize on those evolutions that we don't necessarily know what those are going to look like, right? But we don't want to be the last to move in our category.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it comes back around, I think, to use cases, right? What are businesses considering when investing in generative AI? I know from my perspective, I have personally experienced, but also have heard stories of executives coming in and saying, hey, go add generative AI to this process, or go use generative AI to solve this problem, when at the core of it, that isn't actually a generative AI problem to solve. There are plenty of things out there that actually do function better with either the automation that we already have or the people that we already have, people processes. And this can be for anybody. What do you feel are some of the key factors to consider when identifying appropriate use cases for generative AI in business?
That's actually an interesting point, because one of the stories we saw in the news recently is that Klarna had automated their level 1 customer support, right? And one of the replies to that was, well, that didn't need AI, right? Larger companies have been doing that for a long time, right? They did that a decade ago. So did that really AI? Was that really solving a problem that needed AI? And I think the counter argument would be, yeah, but they probably did it easier, right? It was possible for a smaller company to do. So things that would have required a much bigger investment for Klarna to do, they were able to achieve. And I think that's one of the changes. Joe?
I would agree with that. I think that, a great place to start for any organization, and this is going to vary by the size of your organization and your ability to carry out various project sizes. But I mean, do a gap analysis and see where those suitable generative AI use cases lie. And AI might be able to close those gaps. For example, if your organization needs to improve customer service, your response times, or reduce the spend on a call desk, determine whether generative AI is a reasonable solution for that, and get the right planning in place before you move to make sure that it's secure. But ultimately, I think that gap analysis is a great way to start with determining where generative AI can be brought into your organization successfully.
Mm-hmm.
I would add to that to make sure that you're not using it just to use it, make sure that it's something that you are capable of keeping up with. Like Smiley mentioned earlier, it's something that's going to evolve over time. So make sure that you're able to capitalize on that and continue growing it, instead of just being like, oh, look, we did AI.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I totally agree. I mean, especially over applying it, right? So if we think about it in the customer support type use case, there might be 80% of those requests that come in that can be addressed with something very simple. But those remaining 20% might be totally key to your business, and you want to route them immediately to a human and skip the AI that you had in place. Identifying that for your business seems key to success, right? Because if you get that backwards, you're probably going to hurt yourself a lot, and it'll be hard to come back from.
Yeah. I recognize that there's so many different interpretations and different levels of understanding of what even is AI and generative AI. I was fortunate enough to host a panel recently, and one of the things that we talked about is kind of this sci-fi version of what AI feels like when we take ourselves out of the actual technical reality of where we are today and think about artificial intelligence or sentient artificial intelligence. There's a whole lot that goes into that. We're really not at that point right now, right? So I'd love to kind of break down with each of you, what is generative AI, and really how does it differ from other ML AI models concerning, our security and vulnerabilities and risks?
Smiley, you want to jump in first, or do you want me to?
I'm happy to. I was going to give you a chance.
Yeah.
So
No worries.
I think this is a very interesting question that can get very philosophical pretty quick.
Mhm.
We just saw in the news recently, Anthropic released their Claude 3 model, and they claim that it's better on standardized metrics compared to OpenAI's GPT-4.
Mhm.
And then we'll bring up, well, what do those metrics look like? And how do we measure how this is going, right? So some people say, well, Claude 3 has achieved artificial general intelligence, right?
Mhm.
And then we kind of move the goalposts on what does that mean, right? And so I think it's raising an interesting question when people say, is matrix multiplication intelligence, right? Like if that's what's happening here, is that intelligence? And it may tell us more about our own brains than about the computers, right? It may show that our brains are simpler than we thought. And I think it's having us face a pretty philosophical question of, like, do we revolve around the sun, or does the sun revolve around us, right? Like, are we separate from computers in this realm? So I didn't mean to get too philosophical here, but just to think about, like, if it can do the same things that you would expect a coworker to do, then that's achieving the goal that we're looking for.
Yep.
Sure.
And the other thing that I would say, just from a risk perspective too, if you define generative AI, its main purpose is to generate entirely new content. So text, code, images. I know we've all seen, where people are making deep fake videos, and I think recently there was an entire movie that was output by one of these generative AI models. So unlike the traditional AI models where it's trained for specific tasks, generative models learn the underlying patterns and relationships within data, and they use those to output novel outputs. So that opens up different risks, where traditional AI has standard risks and vulnerabilities associated with it. Generative AI creates several unique risks like malicious content generation, data poisoning and manipulation, privacy leaks through synthetic data, where generative models can create synthetic data that really looks quite close to actual data, and it can be used for privacy preserving applications, just like it can be used to steal data from applications that are not properly secured. So it's a new frontier that needs to be approached, and take it by the reins. That's our advice to everybody, but take it by the reins while taking the precautions as you're taking it by the reins.
Yeah, I think that brings up a really good point. So one of the most defining features of how we're currently interacting with AI is that we are providing it some sort of unstructured input, right? Whereas previously, for us to build a system, we would start with, okay, well, what is the input structure, right? Like, what is the data structure I'm going to get in, and how am I going to put it out? And now the input structure looks like natural language, or at least with the advent of these large language models. And as security people, the first thing that we think of with unstructured input is all the threat surface area of how I don't know what's going to come in. Like, anything could come in. And if I don't have a good way of handling my algorithm inside, my system, and knowing all the different ways that might act, that's where we're going to get all these novel security risks.
Agreed. And on that note, like, we've already seen things that have come out of those inputs, right? So a lot of, I think it was, I don't want to name names, but I think there was a company that had some of its employees plop in, code or something internal that is secret or not supposed to be external, right? But then the algorithm takes it and turns it into what is accessible by everyone else. So it effectively turns all of that secret data or proprietary data into something that can be seen by everyone in bits and pieces. And if you're somebody who's exploiting that, then you're going to be able to get more and more of it. So I think that input snippet is a really great thing to focus on. How can we choose or help people know what is best to put in there and what they should leave out?
Yeah. How do we, so this is really uncovering a lot of risks, right? We've got increased surface area, we've got increased unknowns just in the fact that the generative AI itself can create stuff that doesn't currently exist in the ecosystem, and that can create a lot of unforeseen challenges in our ecosystems. To Alexandria's point as well, humans, as we know in the security space, are usually the actual biggest problem versus the technology. But this almost creates an additional technology that is more human in its behavior and its likelihood to add data or make mistakes or include things that maybe shouldn't be included. Do we want to talk a little bit about the flip side? Are there any ways that we can use generative AI to actually bolster security and compliance?
Yeah, I think there's actually quite a bit that can be done with generative AI to bolster security and compliance. For example, most organizations have to constantly update their security training, their security documentation, their compliance report. And with the proper controls and validation in place, generative AI can be extremely useful for enhancing security awareness training, for doing things like generating simulated phishing emails, real-world attack scenarios. From the standpoint of proactive response, I think generative AI can be used to analyze network traffic patterns, user behavior, and identify anomalies. And there's a lot of tools and technologies out there that are already implementing generative AI into these processes. Again, I think there's a lot that can be said there if it's done with the proper planning and the proper controls implemented early on.
Stephen, if we're kind of digging into, I know Joe mentioned phishing attacks, and aren't those kind of always low-hanging fruit for malicious actors? There's obviously a prevalence of those types of attacks, and we understand phishing attacks, or hopefully we do, right? We're all taking security training and learning not to click on links and to mistrust emails from our colleagues that seem a little bit suspicious. Would you say that there's still a good deal of complexity, though, in carrying out kind of non-phishing based AI attacks? What might that look like from your perspective?
Non-phishing based attacks. Yeah, I mean, I think there's, I think there's still going to be lots of complexity there. The phishing, as much as we try to bring awareness to it, still is one of the top vectors that things start with. And I think that we have the potential to identify those better now, right, as we process that natural language. But the hope is that we can continue to separate out if somebody does take an action based on that we have strong enough security controls that that's not going to lead them to have the keys to our kingdom.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's, especially with AI, you don't have to rely on necessarily people or algorithms that are imperfect to generate these phishing emails or honestly calls at this point, right? We're seeing more and more audio-based kind of traps for folks. Does that help us think more about multi-layered security strategies? Like what would, we really can't just say don't click on an email, don't click on a link. There's more to it that we may want to add layers to our security strategy. What are your thoughts, or anybody on the panel, what an impactful security training program is going to need to look like in this new generative AI age? What do we think we're missing?
I can jump in, I guess.
Yeah, go for it.
I think that defense in depth is actually really important on many levels, right? In how you build your system, and like you mentioned, on the people level as well. But I think that a big part of that is your company's culture. So if you are, as an employee, are empowered to point things out, like, hey, this looks weird, instead of people being like, yeah, whatever, them actually acknowledging it and, looking into it and helping you see what it is that does look weird and why you shouldn't do it. And kind of going that extra mile to make it something that is something you'll learn from, right? So even if it isn't something that is suspicious, it should still be a learning opportunity so that you can hopefully next time have a better idea of what it is that you're looking at and help others around you.
Yeah. I think that one of the ways this has changed is that, okay, so when we talk about like something like phishing, we normally picture an external user, right? So somebody sending something, and our advice tends to be, well, inspect that email. Were you expecting it, right? Like that, those kinds of things. Well, what if that's coming from, a compromised user within my organization? And what we used to see, okay, so they get access to somebody's email, and then they send this like terribly worded, right, very highly suspicious, easy to detect message. But what if that's generated by an LLM, and every single message they send is unique and it's customized to that user? They're able to process all the emails that have been sent from this user to other users. And so now that kind of email doesn't stand out. And it might have been expected, right? And it's not easily triggerable, based on our detection rules, things like that. So culture-wise, we may need to evolve to say, I expect this kind of thing from this person, but my senses have said that, something's wrong, and I'm gonna go contact them anyways, and I'm not going to be afraid to do that, right? Yeah.
I think that's a big thing, that not be afraid to do that, right? So if it comes from a senior manager, a lot of places, bigger places in particular, it's really hard to get a hold of that person to, have them actually validate whether they did it or not.
Yeah. Well, I feel like there's also, and this may be, hopefully this isn't like conspiracy level thinking right now, but I'll allow that it might be. So we all have those sensations of having our phone around while we're having a conversation about something, and then the next time we pick up our phone, there's an ad on an app for that thing that we were talking about, right? I actually had a situation the other day, and I don't know if this is just coincidence or there's some kind of generative AI involved, but I was chatting with some folks on WhatsApp. We were amplifying one of the women in our network, and she has a very unique name. I'd never met anybody with that name. And then in my LinkedIn, I got an invitation from a woman with that name, but not the same last name. And so I, thinking it must be her, click on it and accept it and get this invitation to like chat. So, whether it's just conspiracy level coincidences or not, I think that there are also a lot of cross ecosystem, cross-platform potentials for these systems to engage in. Which kind of brings us around to, there's only so much you can do within your organization, but we really rely on some regulatory frameworks and other compliance structures to help govern our peers, right? Govern other folks that are in our space. We have a question about frameworks being built to address general security. I'd also ask, are there any existing or proposed regulations addressing security implications of generative AI today?
First, I just need to say, you don't keep your phone in a Faraday cage like the rest of us.
I know, right?
Okay.
I do have all of the things that even offer microphones turned off in my house. Like,
okay.
Yeah.
Got to go one step further, I guess.
Yeah. None of us is safe. It's
So to answer your question, there really aren't any regulations, at least in the US right now. There's a few that have been put in place in the EU, so the EU Act, and there's some that have been put in place in China as well. but the US hasn't. So I think there's a few different reasons as to why they haven't. One is that the government moves very slowly. If you take a look at the EU Act, it was proposed in 2021. It was approved last year, and then it will finally go into effect this year. And if you actually think about the timeline on that in relation to technology, it's wild. Like generative AI wasn't even really a big thing in 2021. So to be able to take into consideration everything that they would need to regulate is almost impossible to keep up with it from a government standpoint. And then the other reason I think that the US hasn't is I think that we put a really big priority on not hampering innovation. And so I think that if we are to make regulations around it, it has to be something that is open, right? We don't want it to block new things from going on. We don't want to lose the lead, right? So I think there's a few different places where you can look for things to kind of help with how to handle that on your own. There's an AI governance forum that was started at the Center for New American Security. I think that they're hopefully working on a few things. There's the NIST Trustworthy and Responsible Artificial Intelligence Resource Center, which is quite the mouthful, but they have a risk management framework that you can take a look at. It has a roadmap and a few other things as well. And then we also have an AI ebook that has a checklist in it with a few items that we can go through and make sure that we're following to the best of our ability what we can to keep things secure. But mostly as far as regulations go, everything falls on the companies themselves. So they're responsible for their use of the generative AI. I will put a little bit of a caveat on that though, and say that there are data privacy regulations, which I think play heavily into this. So make sure that you're following the data privacy regulations that are out there.
Yeah, I mean, talk about a tangled web though. I know that obviously there's GDPR and there are a number of specific privacy overarching regulations in various other countries, but our country seems to be going state by state. So be aware of that as well.
We saw in the news that India, for example, passed a regulation saying that people needed approval if they wanted to do any sort of AI like model launch. And, it took their industry by storm, just saying like, well, we're not going to do this here, right? We're going to go somewhere else. So unless we get some worldwide regulation, people are going to do it somewhere, right? And organizations should probably be thinking about how to be responsible, within their own organization for now.
Yeah. Yep. And, I think there are a lot of, one of the things we talk about in our ebook, which there's a resource on the sign up page. So if you wanted to take a look at that ebook, it's listed there. We'll send it out as a resource after this webinar as well. But we also at ScaleSec try to get ahead of actually having a strategy around AI. And I know that a lot of companies will say like, our strategy is don't use it. Right, which causes problems of its own, especially if you've got a workforce who, sometimes folks are underinformed. Sometimes folks are doing things that feel like they're pretty, low bar. They're not a security risk, and so they're doing these things off the side of their desk or in another system or things of that nature. Again, kind of coming back to security, but also kind of compliance with regulations. How important is that understanding of how your company wants to use AI and actually having a way for your team to engage with it if they want? How important is that from your perspectives?
I think that's super important. So I'm working with my clients to take a much more proactive approach to this, right? Understanding that there's likely current use cases, some that are like desired, right? Or some that people feel are inevitable, right? Like this is going to change how I do my day-to-day job, and I can't just ignore it just, because we didn't make a rule allowing it, right? So one of the things that we're asking people to, think about in their governance programs is proactive identification of those use cases. and thinking of it as the positive and not just the negative, right? Like what business value are they seeing from their seat that I might not be seeing?
Yeah.
And how can I do that effectively, right? So as a cloud security partners, we're working with we're working with these organizations to build these securely in their cloud environments, right? And say, okay, so we're going to set you up with a private instance of this where you control the data, you get to test it, you get to like put your own guardrails around it, and it's known and it's not leaking all over the place, and it's not spreading your data to places you had no idea to even think about, right? So I think that proactive approach is super important.
Yeah. And building on the cloud, right? The cloud really came into its own a little over 10 years ago. And there was a lot of organizations who said, we're never going to go to the cloud. We're never going to go to the cloud. And I know Stephen and Alexandria can speak to the fact that we went into multiple organizations where they said, we're just thinking about going into the cloud. And then they found out they've been in the cloud. And what that means is if you don't give your developers, if you don't give your application teams the ability to securely ingest this technology, they will find a way. And so what we are pushing is, yes, do this with precautions, take it slow, make sure you're doing things right, but do not be a blocker, because whether you want to use it or not, your teams will figure out a way to use it. And it's better to do it securely where you can monitor it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. Guardrails, not roadblocks. I think that's the way that security should be in general. There's, like you said, a lot of places that they have just done it anyway. It's a lot better to have them be knowledgeable about what they're actually doing, about the risks involved, and to really have kind of, I don't want to say hand-holding because that's too much, but that that background on why they're doing it the way they're doing it, and still have the functionality of it with a minimized risk front.
Yeah. So if we're kind of coming back full circle a little bit, we've got an idea of some of the various use cases, and we've outlined a few of those in our ebook as well, for where companies might want to use generative AI. We've also uncovered some of the individual contributor or manager leader driven impetus to use AI, whether the company at large has defined a way forward for that or not. And some of that I think is, just best intentions and trying to push the business forward. And some of it, as came up as well, is a little bit fear-based. I need to know how to use this because otherwise I will be left behind, right? As an employee, as a team member. If we're thinking back, right, 10 years in the cloud, what if we look forward 10 years of AI? How do you guys see the business value of generative AI evolving over the next 5 and 10 years? Obviously at a breakneck pace.
That's a good question. And I almost lean in towards the idea that between 10 and 15 years of what we've seen with cloud is probably going to happen much faster with generative AI, because it's a totally different space where it's open to everyone, right? Like anybody who's on this call can go out and open an account on one of the big Gen AI platforms and they can start messing with it. So I think that the rate of consumption is going to increase the rate of evolution. So if I'm looking out years, I'm putting on my security hat and saying, we need to constantly be thinking 20 years ahead of what generative AI is capable now in order to identify what those potential risks might be. And I think it's even more important and incumbent upon the security community to say, not just what those risks are, but how do we mitigate those risks before we get there? Taking things like phishing and human engineering, that's always going to be a weak spot. But what we know is going to be continuous amongst those things is what human engineering is, right? So creating urgencies, playing on people's emotions, those things will not change. And so we can figure out ways to get ahead of those through education, through testing, through any number of things. But I think as we move along, it's going to be important that we keep our crystal ball in front of us.
Yeah, people talk a lot about AI taking people's jobs, and I think that it's much more likely that AI is going to make your business irrelevant before it takes your specific role, right? And the businesses that adapt to this new world, right, and evolve are likely going to be the ones that succeed, rather than those who just ignore it and instruct their, expect their staff to ignore it as well.
Yeah. If I'm a CTO of a company, and I've either put the charter out there to implement generative AI systems into our existing product, in hopes that my company doesn't become obsolete, right? I'm starting to utilize generative AI in my ecosystem. Are there specific best practices from a technology perspective or a setup perspective, or any other guidelines that organizations should follow when trying to actually deploy generative AI systems into their ecosystem to ensure security?
This is definitely an area that's like evolving, right? And I'll share a few of my thoughts, and I'd like to hear the other panelists as well. One of the main ones for me is expect that whatever model you use, like you're gonna pick a different one soon, right? Or it's gonna change or whatever. Like don't like build too much expecting one particular model, right? So application wise, I would want to be able to swap things in and out very carefully. I would also really want to have some robust set of tests that figure out like what am I trying to accomplish, and like am I actually getting that value out of it? I know that can be tough, but I feel like if we don't have that, refactoring over the next few years is going to be really tough to know. The other thing is to think about the determinism of your systems. So do you want your outputs to be diverse, and change every time? Or do you want to make sure that you get the same output for the same input, depending on, what you're doing? Like those are some of like the major considerations. And for us, from a security perspective, I'm working with my clients to help them build up private instances, using the cloud to offload a lot of that work. So for example, AWS offers a variety of different models through their services, so that we can test which ones are appropriate for their use case. And the data that goes into that is never exposed to the organization that made that model, right? So they don't get to like see your data at all. And you also have no access to the underlying infrastructure there. So that model provider, they're not worried about you stealing their intellectual property, right? Sure. They're not worrying about that. So making that where both parties, the model and the user, feel secure.
Yep. And I would say so from a user and a model security, I think he hit it on the head, right? There's data security, there's data filtering and validation. And then from the model security, there's the access control and the model monitoring that I'm sure we're all used to, because we've been doing this for quite a long time on other AI systems as well as general IT systems. But I would say that another place to start, and probably an even more important place to start, is as an organization come together and document what your ethical use is going to be of AI, and get that in front of your teams and make sure that it's well understood before you just send people out to use generative AI.
Mm-hmm.
You definitely stole mine. I was definitely going to say that I think that the making sure that your company knows how they should be using this is definitely one of the top things that you should focus on, right? And that should be something that everyone's on the same page from. And then just from like a technological standpoint, the thing that, and Smiley hit this as well, I think that iterations, right? Like everything's moving so fast, you have to make sure that you're able to build in a way where you can continue to iterate quickly and efficiently and safely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we didn't touch on ethics, but that's also a huge major concern, not only in which models you're using, which LLMs you're using, but also what guardrails you're putting around it, right? There's definitely things that are finding the edges really quickly. I know I heard of a use case of somebody asking Gemini something that had anything to do with young people, and it shut it down because that has the potential to go into a direction that is unsafe or unscrupulous, which is probably the right side of that coin to stand on, but it also can create user frustration as well. Happy to take any questions as folks have them. We did talk about regulations. We don't really have anything, at least in the United States, that is overarching in this space. I know that our regulatory bodies play a role in safeguarding, but perhaps spinning that a little bit until such time as our regulatory bodies have a good sense of that. Do we have any other advice or things to consider as a team, as a company, when utilizing generative AI? How do you recommend that we safeguard against potential security risks in the short term?
I think information sharing is also going to be key. What you can share as an organization, as a case study, as a learning mechanism, and certainly pulling in those like what we experience here at ScaleSec, where we have many opportunities to go into different organizations and capture what works and what is actually securing generative AI is really important. But I do think that knowledge sharing right now seems ironic, given that we're talking about a whole bunch of information that drives generative AI, but the real human to human, B2B, organization to organization knowledge share is going to be really important.
The thing I would add to that is threat modeling, which is a thing that security practitioners bring up all the time. And organizations tend to not be really willing to sit down and spend the time to think that through. But this is a case where it takes a little bit of extra thought, I think, right? To think about the risks that you're introducing, that some of them may be familiar, some of them might be novel, but you don't really know unless you sit down and think about it and build those mitigations and controls in.
Yeah. Anything else from you, Alexandria?
I agree with what Stephen said. I also think that, maybe we could use AI to help us come up with some of those things, right? So we can call on it to help us think through some of the things that we maybe haven't thought of yet. Because I guarantee you that's what people on the threat actors are doing. Like, why not use it for the same thing, but for good?
Yeah. Can't close today without a little bit of a self pitch. Our team obviously deals with not only security and compliance, but the incoming generative AI and other novel systems. How can we, ScaleSec, help organizations kind of balance this drive for innovation and speed with the need to maintain robust security protocols? What types of offerings do we have that can help companies that are curious about generative AI?
The services that we're providing right now are primarily around a couple different categories. So one is governance, right? Helping organizations proactively set up governance and mitigate their risks, but also identify good use cases at the same time. Another one would be helping them securely think about their product and AI opportunities, right? Like what are the unique risks to your product? And then the other one is like helping you actually engineer a secure integration of your of AI into your product, right? So we're getting a lot of calls where people have an idea, but they don't know how to do that securely, right? And so we're helping them do that, and in a very quick amount of time, see the value. Because if you tried to do it maybe on your own, you would risk a lot of security along the way, right? So those are the main categories. And then I would say the other one is staff engagement, right? Because it's all going to start and end with people. So engaging with your staff to help them think through the impacts and risks and address those. So yeah.
Yep. I would say also that one of the things that has come out of cloud is that we've helped a lot of our clients understand and implement a cloud operating model so that they can understand the difference between traditional operation and then cloud. And I think that one of the things that we're seeing drive out of this is that there needs to be an operating model for generative AI. And so we are we're poised and ready to help organizations in defining what that operating model might look like, defining those controls, like Stephen said, and unblocking your organization, aligning to their business needs so that you can get the right level of AI interaction and implementation without the overburden of controls.
Mhm.
Yep. Awesome. So I'll kind of wrap up a bunch of what I heard today. Happy to hear your favorite takeaway from Joe, Alexandria, and Stephen as you choose. But for me, it's, don't avoid it. I think that's a big thing, is don't try to say no to AI necessarily, because your team members are going to get curious. Have a plan that is strategically aligned with your business and understand what use cases are really going to drive value for you. And then think about the unknown unknowns. What are the potential areas where you can shore up your systems, create better processes and controls, and kind of, as much as this is not necessarily something that we want to rely on forever, self-govern a bit of that. What are your ethical constraints? How do you want to use these tools in your ecosystem? Going around the room, any other favorite takeaways from today's conversation? Joe, Alexandria, Stephen?
Always a pleasure getting to hear from Smiley and Alexandria. I think that we're all evolving. I think we're all learning and acquiring new information, and every day we learn something new from each other, and we're happy to share that information and knowledge with our clients as they engage and embark on this new journey.
Yeah,
Awesome.
Absolutely.
All right, we do have a 11 o'clock hour question, so we'll get right to that. I did post the link to our ebook on generative AI. You're welcome to download that. There is an associated checklist that you can link to from inside the ebook. It aligns with some of the NIST frameworks. We also have a cloud security maturity assessment. So that is on our website. You can go take that self-assessment to just have an understanding of what your current security posture is. That will help with any generative AI or really any cloud security gaps that you have. We're always happy to chat, so don't feel shy about reaching out to us. And our final question of the day, oh, there's two in here. BJ's going for it. How do you, let's start with, how do you approach the balance between innovation and responsible use of Gen AI, particularly in sensitive areas such as privacy and data security? I mean, we can talk about our own generative AI policies if we'd like. Alongside that, how do you ensure that the applications prioritize ethical considerations on human well-being? So I'll open either of those questions up to the floor, and we'll spend the last few minutes talking about those.
I'll jump on the approaching the balance between innovation and responsible use of Gen AI. This is going to come down due to a lack of regulation, like we discussed. This is going to come down to organizations taking a stand and making sure that the use of the data that is implemented into these or integrated into these models is integrated in an ethical way. This goes back to what Alexandria and I pointed out. You need to have ethical boundaries defined and well established within your organization. In regards to where we generally go, I think that if we want to continue using generative AI, if we want to continue to be the innovators, take the lead in this country, we need to make sure that we are holding ourselves accountable to those ethics, because generally what happens when we don't have these regulations is we end up with a house fire, something catastrophic happens, and then the immediate reaction is it's overly restrictive. And so we end up in an even bigger mess. So hold people accountable, hold your organizations accountable, be honest about what the intent of generative AI is, and flag things that are unethical, because that is going to be important.
I think a good example of that is, I mean, it's a small thing, but like having some way for people to say, hey, this maybe is a little off, right? Like for example, some pictures that came out a little while ago that were completely historically inaccurate, having a way to say, hey, we did this, we apologize, let's fix it for better next time.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I really think that the human oversight is going to continue to be a critical component in the short term, especially. And, I think that there are a lot of potentials, there are many jobs that exist today that didn't exist 20 years ago. And many of those are due to advances in technology. So, though some jobs fall away as we get more sophisticated or as things fall out of being necessary, other jobs emerge, and we don't know what those will look like yet. So, well, thanks so much for everyone tuning in. If you got the recording, feel free to reach out with any additional questions. And thanks for attending ScaleSec's first official webinar. Send us some notes about what you'd like to hear about next. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks.
Thank you.